The world's first firearms were invented during the Middle Ages, and they certainly looked a lot different than their modern counterparts. Weird designs and intriguing concepts. Today we're taking a look at the top 15 earliest firearms ever made. Number 15. Chinese fire lances. Gunpowder was first invented in China during the 9th century, when alchemists realized that the perfect blend of sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter was explosive. To begin with, it was used for medicinal purposes, but as the production process became more refined, it started being used in weaponry. The first recognizable type of personal firearm emerged at some point during the following century, and was known as a fire lance. It was essentially a type of spear with a small explosive charge contained within bamboo casing at the end, which was detonated at the beginning of hand-to-hand combat with an enemy to startle the opposing fighter to gain an edge. With the improvement of gunpowder, however, fire lances became more explosive and were filled with pellets. So when they were triggered, they functioned as a shotgun and a flamethrower hybrid weapon. Still, they only had a short range of between 3 to 10 feet. But as designs improved, the lance element was removed, and they became far more recognizable as an early form of gun. By the early 13th century, the devices were being made from metal and gave Chinese troops a major advantage over their enemies, who had yet to develop anything of the sort, and still relied on arrows, spears, and swords to fight with. Number 14. The Heilongjiang hand cannon. Thought to have been built at some time before the year 1288, the Heilongjiang hand cannon is the oldest surviving firearm in the world. It was found in the 1970s during an archaeological dig in the Heilongjiang province of China, and has all the hallmarks of being made during the Jin dynasty. At 13.4 inches long and weighing 7.8 pounds, the weapon is made from bronze and would have been held beneath the bulbous section, which is called the aoshi, and is where the gunpowder explosion would have occurred to propel the projectile forwards. There's a small touch hole on the chamber, which is where the user would insert a fuse to ignite the gunpowder, and the barrel would have likely been stuffed with pellets and produced a shotgun-like effect. In records that have been found from around that time, there's a story that talks of a commander who led his troops into a military camp to quell a rebellion that was developing there. They were all armed with hand cannons like these, and since the rebels didn't have any form of firearm at all, they were quickly overcome and either killed or arrested. Number 13. Bedil Tombak. The Bedil Tombak is an early type of firearm that translates to mean pike gun, and was a small cannon that was attached to a long wooden pole that allowed users to push it close towards their enemy without putting themselves too much at risk. They were mainly used in what is now the Indonesian archipelago from between the 13th and 15th centuries, and it's thought most likely that they were modeled after similar Chinese designs. At the time, the Javanese became renowned as expert firearm producers and had developed a number of improvements and techniques that meant their armies were a force to be reckoned with. During the siege of Malacca in 1511, for example, they arrived armed with cannons, firing tubes, and early forms of Matchlocks guns, and had soon won the battle as a result. Quite when Bedil Tombak designs were created isn't entirely clear, but the earliest date from around the same time. They were used for hundreds of years because of how relatively easy they were to manufacture and how effective they were against the poorly equipped enemy forces. And the last mention of the use of one in battle comes from as late as the 19th century. Number 12. European matchlocks. The first firearms began to appear in Europe in the early 15th century, and they were the first ones to use what's called a matchlock mechanism. Previous designs required users to use a lit match to trigger the detonation of the gunpowder, but this severely limited how effective they were, because it would take a person's full attention to carefully fire, which meant that they weren't so able to concentrate on aiming. The matchlock mechanism, however, took care of this process so the user could hold the weapon steady and significantly increase the effectiveness of the weapon, and led to their widespread use in armies across the continent. It works by holding a lit match in a clamp, and when a lever is pulled lower down on the body, the clamp would drop down, so the match fell into a flash pan and ignites the priming powder. This would in turn travel through the touch hole and ignite the gunpowder. Releasing the lever caused the clamp to lift back up and the flash pan to clear, and once the remains of the match were removed, the weapon could then be reloaded. Matchlock guns were definitely quite cumbersome to use, but were a major improvement on previous designs, and were what really made militaries take note of how effective gunpowder weapons could be. Number 11. French Arquebus. As European militaries began using matchlock weapons, their designers got to work to develop more effective weapons. It wasn't long until the arquebus became commonplace, and was used by various armies, particularly the French by the end of the 15th century. Coming from the Dutch word Arquebus, which means hook gun, the Arquebus was a long gun that had a hook-like projection from beneath its main barrel that could be used to steady it against walls or battlements before firing. Originally, they were used as a defensive weapon, but with the addition of matchlock firing mechanisms, they were soon used on the offensive too. Over the next century, the designs of the Arquebus continued to be improved, and by 1525 they had shoulder stocks, priming pans, and were the first known firearms to be fitted with a trigger. A larger version, also known as the heavy arquebus or the musket, was also developed. These would usually be mounted on wagons and used to penetrate armor. They were able to shoot lead balls that weighed around 3.5 ounces, although for a long time the size of projectile needed was determined by how the manufacturer had made the gun's barrel. By the 16th century, efforts were made to standardize their shape and to make it easier to supply ammunition to troops. These new versions of the arquebus were called calibers, and it's these that led to the use of a caliber in reference to a specific size of bullet. Number 10. Java Arquebus. By the end of the 15th century, troops in Java were using a newly designed weapon of their own. Similar to the arquebus that was used in Europe, the Java Arquebus was a long gun that had a wider barrel at the center, which gradually reduced in size towards the end to help guide the projectile and make the weapon as accurate as possible. The weapons were used by local armies, although they weren't in great supply, so were only available to the best marksmen, and helped people repel invasions from European countries whose armies weren't prepared to fight against such firepower. There's an account of the use of the Java Arquebus from records of a battle in what is now Indonesia, when the Kingdom of Majapahit were battling Giri forces. The Majapahit troops equipped with Java Arquebuses shot their 7-foot-long weapons towards the enemy, who fell dead in their hundreds because their armor was completely ineffective at stopping the power of the bullets. Number 9. Wheellock Pistols. Wheellock pistols were designed in Europe at the beginning of the 16th century, and for a while were commonly used alongside matchlock firearms. They were the first self-igniting pistols because all previous ones used lit matches to trigger the gunpowder and had an ingenious design for the time. It's thought by some that they were designed by Leonardo da Vinci, as drawings from around the time appear to depict the firing mechanism, although he may have actually been improving on a design from an unknown German inventor from a few years earlier. The basic way they worked was by pulling the trigger, which spun a spring-loaded steel wheel against a small piece of pyrite, and this created a shower of sparks. The sparks landed on a pan that held a small amount of gunpowder, and when this ignited, it would flash through a small touch hole and trigger the larger amount of gunpowder within the weapon's barrel. It's a similar method to how some lighters work to this day, where a wheel is turned to create a spark against a wick or a fuel vapor, and the wheellock soon became an advantage over other weapons because they could be fired with one hand and didn't need as much preparation before they were ready to use. They were, however, much more expensive to make, so weren't widely distributed, so only the wealthiest people had them.
We're constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button.
Number 8. Istinggar. As designs for firearms were improved throughout the Nusantara archipelago, which is now known as Indonesia, attempts were made to take back the matchlock mechanism and apply it to a far more accurate and powerful weapon. The result was called the Istinggar, and was the result of the influence of Portuguese technology after the European nation made incursions in the region in the early 16th century. They were much shorter than the Javan arquebus, and as a result were much easier to handle and take into close combat. Still, they could only hold one shot at a time and had to be reloaded with gunpowder and have a new lit match inserted into the mechanism before they could be fired again, which restricted quite how useful they could be. The Istinggar was, however, a major improvement in weapon design and surprised the Spanish troops when they arrived to try to take control of the islands. They were forced to regroup and try to plan a new way of attack because they hadn't got anything that could protect them against the firepower that the Istinggar could produce. It was the design of this weapon that solidified people in the Nusantara and some of the greatest firearms manufacturers throughout history, and they became the envy of other militaries around the world. Number 7. Snaplock Guns. Faced with the choice of the cumbersome matchlock weapons or the complicated and expensive wheellock pistols, designers in Germany came up with a completely new type of firearm in the 1540s. Known as Snaplock Guns, these relied on using a spring-powered cock with a piece of flint on it, which at first are pulled back, and then when the trigger is pulled, would snap down onto a hardened steel plate to create a shower of sparks. These would fall down onto a pan that held the priming powder, and the flash from that would travel through the touch hole to enter the firing chamber, which was at the rear of the gun's barrel, and ignite the gunpowder that was there to propel the bullet forwards. This design was only ever really used by people in Germany, across Scandinavia, and in Russia, and was much cheaper to produce than alternatives. One of the benefits was that it could be primed to fire before it was needed, which meant people could go into battle prepared. In the main, though, snaplocks only remained in use for around 100 years, by which time the principles that had been developed in their design were being used for more effective and deadly weapons. Number 6. Snaphaunce Guns. The natural successor to the Wheellock pistol was called a Snaphaunce gun. And while the name originates in Dutch, it's not entirely clear where they were first developed. They began being used across Europe from the mid-16th century and was the weapon of choice for soldiers and individuals for the next 70 years. In a similar way to the Snaplock gun, Snaphaunce guns created a shower of sparks by dropping a spring-loaded cock with a flint onto a plate of hardened steel. Again, these sparks would ignite primer powder in the pan, which in turn would heat up the gunpowder in the barrel through a touch hole. The main difference between them and Snaplock guns was the design of the pan. It would quite often rain or be windy across Europe, and an open pan would almost always get wet, or the primer powder would be blown away. To overcome this issue, a cap was placed over the pan, which was tied in with the firing mechanism, so when the trigger was pulled, the cap would open so the sparks could enter and ignite the powder. As a further safety feature, the steel plate could be moved forwards, so that if the cock was accidentally released, it wouldn't make contact and create a shower of sparks. This was particularly important while reloading or storing the weapons, which previously had been one of the more dangerous parts of using a firearm from the owner's perspective. Number 5. Flintlocks. By the early 17th century, major advances had been made in metallurgy and understanding how to get the best out of a firearm. And while Snaphaunce guns had been much more effective than previous designs, there was still quite some way to go. This led to the development of flintlock guns, which used the same principle of striking flint to create a spark, but because they were more efficient, the mechanism could be applied to weapons of different sizes. This was the invention that led to a much wider range of firearms. Flintlocks were used to make pistols for self-defense or as a military sidearm, muskets that had longer barrels and would be the main weapons of European armies for almost 200 years, and rifles, which were particularly popular in Germany for use in hunting. To use them, the owner would move the cock back into its safety position to prevent an accidental fire, and then load the gun, usually through the muzzle, with black powder and a round lead ball that was often wrapped in cloth. This would be stuffed into the barrel with a ramrod, and then a small amount of powder was placed in the flash pan. It was then ready to fire, and simply required the cock to be pulled back, the trigger to be pressed, and this would strike the flint onto a piece of steel to create sparks that would ignite the powder in the pan. There were a few problems with this design, however, not the least the fact that they took quite some time to reload. Even the most proficient handlers would take at least 15 seconds before they were able to shoot again, and this could mean the difference between life and death. Accidental firing was also quite common, because hot embers could be left inside the barrel before it was reloaded, and armies had to develop techniques to ensure everyone would shoot theirs at the same time, because the weapons often produced so many sparks that they could trigger one another that's being held nearby. Number 4. Queen Anne Pistol. While flintlock firearms were used for more than 2 centuries, that doesn't mean their design wasn't perfected over that time. First created in England in the late 18th century, Queen Anne pistols were a particular type of flintlock weapon that were ideal for personal use because they were small enough to conceal. It was a time when highway robberies at gunpoint were becoming increasingly common, and wealthy customers needed something to protect themselves with. The difference with them in comparison to other flintlock designs was that the breech and the trigger plate were combined into one piece along with the lock plate, and this made them much easier to use. Another difference was that the bullets were slightly larger than the barrel, which meant that a much larger gas pressure would build up behind it before shooting it forward. This created a much more deadly and devastating shot, along with a rifled barrel, meant that users would almost certainly hit a target at short range. Cleverly, the barrel would detach from the gun, which meant that one could be reloaded while a second was already fitted and ready to use. This design meant that there was no need to use a ramrod to push the bullet and powder back into the barrel, and meant that a second shot could be fired in quick succession. They didn't, however, take off as military weapons, because in the chaos of a battle, soldiers often found they'd drop the barrel and be left without a functioning weapon. As a personal defense pistol, though, it was perfect. Number 3. Dueling Pistol. Flintlock pistols weren't always the most reliable of weapons, and there could be quite a delay between pulling the trigger and the bullet firing. This often wouldn't be too much of a problem, but there was one situation when two identical pistols functioning differently was seen as inherently unfair: a duel. Because of this, sets of dueling pistols were created to much more precise specifications than other pistols. By making them from the same materials and tuning them to the same standard, users could be sure that it was their aim and reflexes that would determine who would win or who would lose, and not the luck of the draw. They had much heavier and longer barrels to help steady their aim and to reduce the recoil, and after originally having circular barrels when they were first produced in the 1700s, the later ones had octagonal barrels. Dueling pistols were also incredibly ornate and carefully crafted by hand to make sure they were the most reliable of weapons at the time. This, of course, meant that they were far more expensive, which is why people just didn't use them as their normal weapons of choice, and they'd be sold in sets of 2, where each weapon was indistinguishable. They were very effective at short range, which worked for duels where participants were only around 40 feet apart, but beyond that distance they were tricky to aim, so wouldn't have had much use for anything other than close combat anyway. Number 2. Cap locks. After more than 200 years of flintlock guns being the weapons of choice around the world, the firearms industry was overdue for another revolution. This came in the 19th century with the development of the so-called cap-lock pistol, which instead of relying on flints to create a shower of sparks, used a percussion cap. The cap itself is a cylinder made from either copper or brass with a closed end and an open end. It's filled with a small amount of highly explosive material such as mercuric fulminate. This cap was placed on the outside of the weapon and connected with a small tube that led to inside the barrel, so that when the trigger is pulled, a hammer drops onto the cap to cause it to explode. The charge goes through the tube into the barrel and ignites the gunpowder, and the weapon fires. What's particularly useful about this design is that it can be used in any weather condition and could be adapted for firearms of virtually any size. The first cap-lock weapons were actually designed for use in hunting, but once their superior reliability was realized, they were soon replacing flintlock guns at an incredible rate. Double-barreled guns became more common because the cap was far more successful in firing both chambers, in comparison to a flintlock mechanism, and as the triggering device was contained and compact, smaller guns became possible too. They were much quicker and easier to reload as well, which led to many older flintlock guns being refitted to use caps instead. Number 1. Colt Paterson. When Samuel Colt patented his handgun design in 1836, he probably had no idea how influential a creation it would turn out to be. It's a moment that's now looked back as the beginning of modern-day firearms and would change the face of warfare forever. Even with cap-lock guns, most weapons had been single-use before needing to be reloaded, but Colt's invention allowed for multiple shots to be fired and were, as a result, far more effective and lethal. The first of his revolver designs was called the Colt Paterson in honor of the town where it was made in New Jersey. It was a 28 caliber 5-shot revolver, and once loaded, all a user would need to do was pull back the cock and pull the trigger. It would fall forward and contact the casing in the chamber, which contained black powder and a bullet. The powder would detonate and the bullet would shoot, but the ingenious thing about this design is that the user could cock the weapon again, twist the barrel, and it was already primed to fire once more. The only real limitation of these early designs of the revolver was that the weapon had to be partially dismantled before it could be reloaded. But it gave such a significant time advantage by holding 5 shots at once that this wasn't enough to deter people from transitioning to them. A few years later, he developed a version with a reloading lever, and reloading was much simpler. And unusually, they had folding triggers, which meant that the trigger would only become visible once the gun had been cocked. This was probably for the best though, because it would be many more years before a safety mechanism was added to prevent accidental firing. Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.